He was the voice of a generation, a man whose songs about sunshine, mountains, and country roads became the soundtrack for millions. John Denver was more than a musician, he was an icon of wholesomeness, a symbol of a simpler, more natural way of life. His music spoke of clear skies and gentle winds, a deep and abiding love for the planet. Which is what makes the final moments of his life so profoundly disturbing. On October 12, 1997, John Denver, an experienced pilot, climbed into his experimental aircraft and took off over the serene waters of Monterey Bay, California. He would never return. For years, the story was told as a tragic but straightforward accident. A beloved singer, a small plane, a fatal miscalculation. But the official report, the one meant to close the book on his death, tells a much darker story. It's a story of strange modifications, baffling decisions, and a series of warnings that went ignored. The mystery of John Denver's death isn't about a conspiracy or some hidden, sinister plot. The truth, buried in the dry, technical language of the investigation, is far more unsettling. It's the story of a preventable accident, and the grim, final details reveal a picture much more troubling than anyone wanted to believe. What if the man who sang "Sunshine on My Shoulders" died because he knowingly flew a plane that was a ticking time bomb? What if the official cause of the crash, pilot error, was just the final link in a chain of reckless choices that made his death almost inevitable? This isn't just speculation. This is what the evidence, compiled by crash investigators, points to. And it's a story that changes everything you might think you know about the final flight of John Denver. To understand the unsettling truth, first, we have to look at the story everyone heard in the days and weeks after the crash. On that clear Sunday afternoon, John Denver was practicing touch-and-go landings at Monterey Peninsula Airport. He was flying a unique, futuristic-looking aircraft, a Rutan Long-Easy, which he'd just bought. He was alone. Witnesses on the ground and on boats in the bay reported hearing a pop or a backfire, then sudden silence as the engine cut out. The plane, flying at only about 350 to 500 feet, then pitched sharply downward and plunged into the Pacific Ocean in a steep, fatal nosedive. The initial investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, seemed to have a clear-cut explanation. The probable cause was listed as fuel starvation. Basically, the plane ran out of gas in one of its two tanks. The NTSB concluded that Denver, in that moment of crisis, got distracted trying to switch to the second fuel tank, lost control, and crashed. The report cited key factors like inadequate pre-flight planning and his inexperience with this specific type of aircraft. It's a sad story, but a familiar one in aviation. A pilot, even an experienced one like Denver with over 2,700 flight hours, gets into a new plane, makes a mistake at a critical moment, and pays the ultimate price. It's a narrative of a simple, heartbreaking accident. But it's also a narrative that conveniently papers over some deeply disturbing details that turn this story from a tragedy into something much darker. The official story isn't wrong, it's just not the whole story. And what it leaves out is the most important part. The real story isn't about what happened in the final seconds of his flight, it's about the decisions that put him in that cockpit in the first place. To unravel this, the first thread you have to pull is the aircraft itself. Denver wasn't flying a standard Cessna. He was piloting a Rutan Long-Easy, an experimental, home-built aircraft constructed from a kit. While designed by the brilliant aeronautical engineer Burt Rutan, the very nature of a kit plane means the builder can make their own modifications. And the builder of this particular plane had made a critical, and ultimately fatal, one. The standard Long-Easy design places the fuel selector valve, the handle that lets a pilot switch between the left and right fuel tanks, right between the pilot's legs. It's an intuitive, easy-to-reach spot. But the builder of Denver's plane, reportedly to avoid running fuel lines through the cockpit, moved it. He relocated the valve to the bulkhead behind the pilot's left shoulder. This wasn't a minor tweak, it was a fundamental and dangerous change. To switch fuel tanks in this plane, a pilot would have to take their hand off the controls, likely loosen their shoulder harness, turn their body 90 degrees, and grope for a handle they couldn't even see. It was an incredibly awkward and dangerous maneuver to attempt in mid-air, especially at a low altitude. In fact, when NTSB investigators simulated the action, they found that twisting so severely in the seat naturally caused the pilot's right foot to press the right rudder pedal, which would send the plane into a sharp, uncontrolled turn. But here's where it gets worse. John Denver knew about this catastrophic design flaw. Before the fatal flight, he and a mechanic had discussed the valve's terrible placement. They even tried to rig a solution by clamping a pair of vice grip pliers onto the handle to make it easier to grab, but it didn't really fix the issue. Denver still couldn't reach it while safely strapped in his seat. He knew the valve was a problem and had plans to get it moved back to its proper location. But he hadn't done it yet. He chose to fly it anyway. This single fact shifts the entire narrative. His death stops looking like just an accident. It was the direct result of flying an aircraft with a known, life-threatening defect. Other pilots who had flown this exact plane later described nearly crashing when they had to make that same dangerous contortion to switch tanks. One said he refused to even try switching tanks in the air because he knew how hazardous it was. The plane had a history of almost killing its pilots. And Denver knew it. That dangerously placed fuel valve was the loaded gun in this story. But it was John Denver's own decisions on October 12 that pulled the trigger. The most baffling of these was his choice not to refuel the plane before taking off. He arrived at Monterey Peninsula Airport that afternoon after having already flown in from Santa Maria, a trip that burned a good amount of fuel. The fuel gauges, just like the selector valve, were in a terrible spot, located in the rear cockpit, completely invisible to the pilot. Denver had to ask a mechanic on the ground to look and tell him how much fuel was left. The estimate was grim. The right tank had about 6 gallons, but the left tank, which the plane was set to draw from, had only about 3 gallons. A mechanic on site specifically asked Denver if he wanted to refuel. Denver said no. Let that sink in for a moment. An experienced pilot, who knew his plane had a dangerously inaccessible fuel switch, chose to take off with critically low fuel in one tank. He was effectively setting a timer on his own flight. He had to know that at some point in the very near future, the engine would sputter and die as that left tank ran dry. And he knew that when it did, he'd be forced to perform a difficult, distracting, and destabilizing maneuver at low altitude to save himself. So why would he make such a choice? Overconfidence? A bad lapse in judgment? The answer might lie in another unsettling fact: he wasn't technically supposed to be flying at all. Nearly a year before the crash, the FAA had revoked his medical certificate, a document every pilot must have to legally fly. The revocation came after Denver had 2 DUI arrests in 1993 and 1994. The FAA determined he had failed to maintain sobriety and was therefore medically disqualified from operating an aircraft. He was sent certified letters asking him to surrender his certificate, which he reportedly ignored. On the day of the crash, John Denver was flying illegally. Now, to be perfectly clear, post-mortem toxicology reports found absolutely no drugs or alcohol in his system. Intoxication was not a factor in the accident itself. But his history and his decision to fly without a valid medical certificate paint a picture of someone who was perhaps used to pushing boundaries and ignoring rules, even ones for his own safety. That decision not to refuel, seen through this lens, looks less like a simple mistake and more like part of a pattern, a belief that he could handle a risky situation he himself had created. He'd bought the plane just a couple of weeks earlier and had only about a half hour of real flight time in it. He had minimal experience with the Long Easy's unique handling. So, on October 12, 1997, the situation was this: an illegally flying pilot, with very little experience in a new and unfamiliar experimental plane, took off with insufficient fuel, knowing the only way to get to his reserve gas was to perform a dangerous maneuver that had nearly caused previous pilots to crash. It wasn't a question of if an emergency would happen, but the mystery of John Denver's death isn't much of a mystery at all. The NTSB report laid out the probable cause with cold precision. Denver's attention was diverted trying to switch fuel tanks, which led to him accidentally pushing the right rudder, losing control, and crashing. But the story behind that technical language is what's truly unsettling. This was not a freak accident. It was the predictable end to a series of terrible decisions. The real mystery isn't what happened, but why a man with Denver's experience would willingly put himself in such a dangerous situation. The answer seems to lie in a fatal mix of poor judgment and a dangerous machine. Imagine those final moments. He's flying just 500 feet above the cold Pacific. The engine sputters and goes quiet, just as witnesses described and just as he must have known it would. The silence in the cockpit must have been deafening. The problem he chose to ignore on the ground was now a life-or-death crisis in the air. According to investigators, to even try to reach the valve, he would have had to loosen his harness, twist his body in the cramped cockpit, and fumble behind his shoulder for a small handle. While his attention was completely focused on this desperate task, his right foot, as investigators predicted, almost certainly pressed on the rudder. The aircraft, now without engine power to help stabilize it, would have yawed sharply to the right. The nose would have dropped, and in an instant, the plane would have entered a steep, unrecoverable dive. He was so close to the water there was no time to correct, no time to even process the final, fatal mistake. The plane hit the water with incredible force, causing the multiple blunt force trauma, cited as his official cause of death. This is the unsettling truth. The crash wasn't an if, it was a when. The design flaw was the first link in the chain. His inexperience was the second. Flying illegally was the third. And his decision not to refuel was the fourth and final link that pulled him from the sky. The mystery is solved not by looking for a conspiracy, but by accepting the dark and simple facts laid out in the official report. He died because of a series of his own choices that, when put together, made disaster all but certain. John Denver's music gave joy to millions. He sang about the beauty of the natural world, about peace, and living in harmony with the earth. That idealized image is what makes the reality of his death so hard to accept. It wasn't a poetic or peaceful end. It was messy, desperate, and, most tragically, completely avoidable. The official report closes the case on a technical level, but it opens up a much more profound and disturbing human story. It's a cautionary tale about how even beloved figures aren't immune to poor judgment and the deadly consequences of ignoring clear warnings. The legacy of John Denver will always be his incredible music and his love for the environment. But his death adds a somber, complicated, and deeply human chapter to that legacy. The mystery is solved. There was no foul play, no conspiracy. The darkness in this story comes from a simple, unsettling truth. A man who brought so much light to the world died as a result of his own bad decisions, culminating in a few frantic, fatal moments alone above the ocean, in a machine he never should have been flying. The story of John Denver's final flight is a complex one, with layers that go far beyond the initial headlines. What do you think is the most troubling part of this story? Do you see it as a tragic accident or something else? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video compelling, please give it a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories you only think you know. Thanks for watching.